We are moments away from the start of trading on a very exciting day because futures are off 1% or more, depending on the major average of your choice. You can see the S&P future right there, bang on 1%. Well, now a little lower. The NASDAQ down a little bit more than 1%. Futures, this is futures, 1.5% for the small stocks for the Russell. There you see. Well, you saw, for a moment, executives at Cosmo, Cosmopolitan magazine. They're ringing the bell because it's the love issue. Hey, Mac Culkin is on the cover with Brenda's song. That's pretty cool. Over at the NASDAQ market site, JetBlue is ringing the bell. Their stock is down 70% over the last 5 years. So hopefully they get a little bit of lift from this. Katie, in terms of, do you subscribe to Cosmo, by the way?
I don't subscribe to Cosmo. I look at it in the grocery store. I actually just flew JetBlue to and from Louisiana, and it was an okay experience, but stock not really reflecting that. Anyway, let's talk about these major averages because, boy, it is ugly. At least, of course, 39 seconds into trading, the S&P 500, like Matt was previewing, currently down about 1%. The NASDAQ 100, your big tech stocks, faring a little bit worse, but really a lot of the pain is being expressed in the small caps. It certainly hurts when you have yields higher across the Treasury curve from the short end to the long end. The Russell 2000 down about 1.5%. Meanwhile, you take a look under the hood. There is some good news to be found, and that's in CVS. Profit guidance for the year coming in just below Wall Street expectations as high costs and government limitations hit its store and insurance businesses. But even still, you can see the stock is flying right now because that guidance signals improvement for CVS. Of course, it's been under a lot of pressure lately. This is a turnaround story that we're keeping an eye on. Shares up about 10% right now, Shanali.
And Katie, I want to zoom into a story I know that you've been watching very closely over the last couple of weeks, which is Meta inching towards $2 trillion in value after 17 straight sessions of gains. The company also made a tweak to its accounting formula to measure depreciation of its AI spending, likely increasing the company's profits by billions of dollars each year. You could take a look at the move you've seen, but we are taking a bit of a breather, of course, with the rest of the market. This has been what has been holding up in large form the Magnificent Seven trade, Matt, in a lot of ways.
All right, an impressive run that has turned around. Well, not completely, obviously. The chart is up and to the right. Super Micro delivered an aggressive long-term revenue outlook and pledged to meet a NASDAQ deadline to file audited financial results. They're best when they're audited for public companies. It sees fiscal year 2026 sales nearly doubling to $40 billion. And then finally, Shanali was talking about the shares earlier. They're down 15%. Lyft gave a disappointing outlook for the current quarter, saying it's cold out there. And when it's cold, apparently people don't book cars as much. Does that make any sense to you?
It doesn't make sense. I needed a car this morning. It's snowing, and I couldn't find one.
I use them more often when it's cold.
And maybe it's an excuse of seeing those cars go to other platforms.
Maybe you just want to stay inside, you know, and watch TV. That's what I do
Netflix
regardless of the weather. Yeah.
All right, let's take a closer look with Bloomberg Technology co-host Carolyn Hyde.
You guys need to cycle more because that's what's being impacted. I took my little Lyft bike, City Bike today, but I was the only one that dusted off the snow.
Hang on, City Bike is now Lyft branded?
Yeah. Well, Lyft manages the platform, and they said fewer cyclists because of the snow in particular.
So what about City? Wasn't it Citibank? Wasn't that the whole thing in this city?
There's City Bikes.
Yeah, they have a combination. They're still branded City, but if you want to get them on a useful subscriber, no promotions here, but Lyft is a way to do it.
Okay. But the point is, they're saying cold weather.
Yep.
Means fewer bookings.
And just competition more broadly.
Yeah,
Look, this is a company that doesn't have the international footprint that Uber does, so they've lost that deal with Delta, which has been crimping their forward-looking guidance. They're also just seeing that they're having to compete hard on price. People are they've got a record amount of people riding using Lyft, more than 24 million. Why? Because people like locking in the price of the future. Look at inflation today. We want more price transparency, so people want to lock in when they're going to the airport. So they actually did pretty well on their fourth quarter and their full year as a whole. When you look at fiscal for the 2024, revenue was up 31%. It was up 27% for fiscal fourth quarter. But it's a forward-looking guidance, as we saw with Uber once again, that really let down the side.
Yeah, and Uber falling in sympathy right now, down about 3%, as Shanali points out in our chat. Let's talk about Supermicro.
You chatting amongst each other?
We are. We do. We have a little club underneath the surface of the show.
You need to invite me, guys.
Let's talk about Supermicro, though, because this is the story that feels like it keeps on giving, and apparently it gave some some good news?
Depends who is giving to. Keeps on giving you news, that's for sure. That's extraordinary. True. I mean, what's Vital Research put out a note, and look, the forward-looking guidance is phenomenal. For $40 billion to come in their fiscal 2026, that's well above the expectations of $30 billion. But they said, look, you've got to believe them because they missed on their fiscal second quarter, and ultimately they haven't been giving you any accounted numbers since back in August 2024. The NASDAQ is threatening to delist them unless they get their accounted financials over to them by the 25th of February. They promise. They say they are hopeful that's going to happen. They were dropped by Ernst & Young. They're being investigated by the DOJ, but it's good because we're going to believe them that they're going to deliver $40 billion. Look, many analysts are out there saying this looks really good, and if it speaks to the level of AI demand, they make servers with these incredibly powerful Blackwell chips in them. They need liquid cooling to keep them cool. That's really something that Supermicro offers, and they say their technology is the best. Well, maybe we can see this ramp, and maybe it's good news from here on out.
Caroline, would love for you to weigh in on Meta as well. It's just been an extraordinary run. I believe, Katie, you were saying the longest you've ever seen.
And it was up yesterday at the close.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then we thought it was going to turn over.
It got it. 18 days, right?
How do investors feel about the valuation right now?
Well, I think ultimately they feel that this is the AI winner of choice. And I think with Meta having been up 17 straight days, if you look at actual delivery in terms of what it's done in those 17 days, over the course of this year, it's up about 20%. It's not the best performing stock on the NASDAQ. Palantir is up about 40%. So it's not astronomical moves compared to some others in the market like ARM, like Palantir. But we have just seen day in, day out this incremental growth that gives it almost a $2 trillion valuation, as we're saying. And as you'd point out, 17 straight day run, that is the best that we've ever seen on the NASDAQ ever, let alone on Meta ever. But I think that just does seem to need to deliver now. We're seeing the AI enthusiasm coming from Mark Zuckerberg. We're talking about LLMs and open source. Many believe it.
Yeah, well, Mark Zuckerberg certainly has a hot hand to start 2025. Great breakdown,
and
Caroline.
And he wears a necklace.
I like the necklace.
Heavy necklace.
Yeah. I mean, he is just trumping everybody in the
Pardon the pun. Are you trying to pardon the pun?
Oh, no. I definitely didn't do that on purpose. Sorry.
All right. We know we have a big Bloomberg Technology coming up with Caroline at 11 a.m., but...
You don't really, because Powell.
Oh, my gosh, you're right. Well,
true.
We'll be thinking
Why
of
did you
you
even come in today?
Because I wanted to see you guys.
And we so appreciate it. Well, you can catch Caroline Hyde on Bloomberg Technology, not today, but tomorrow and every other day. But let's keep the conversation going now with Federated Hermes Senior Equity Strategist Linda Dissel. Linda, great to have you on a very busy day in markets. You're seeing basically stocks crater across the board in the wake of that CPI. It seems like earnings season isn't going over too well either. Talk to us about how you're feeling at this moment, of course, as we tumble from these lofty heights.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much for having me on the show. You know, I don't know if the S&P's down less than 1% on the day. It's really the kind of market, isn't it, that we've been getting used to over the last number of months. You're speaking of a few big names up 20 or 40% on a year-to-date basis, and then one day somebody disappoints and goes down hard. We expected at Federated Hermes that this would be a volatile first half, and it very well may prove to be so. There's a lot of things you can worry about. You can worry about the CPI, and yes, it did surprise to the upside. And, you know, even after you take out some of the things that, like used cars and medical and rents, it's still up pretty strong. But we've been suggesting that, you know, probably you'd be stuck in a range here for a while, and it may be a while until you continue to bleed down. We at Federated Hermes have a 2.7% core CPI figure for year end, and we still feel that way.
It's still too high, Linda, especially, you know, Jerome Powell's talking about averaging. You know, if you want to hit the target of 2% on an average, considering how far above it we were for so long and still are, we need to hold below that level for a hell of a long time until it really equals out.
Yes, absolutely true. The 2% target has seemed to us to be probably unrealistic for quite some months now, and we've become to think that maybe even closer to 3%, 2.5% to 3% would be where the Fed would call victory, where we have to realize that we may now be in a structurally higher inflationary environment than we had been for 15 years. And that's what happens when you settle down from a 40-year high in inflation. So, you know what, that's not good news, but average hourly earnings came up over 4% in this last payroll figure, and our real earnings are actually going up in recent months here as workers.
So one question I have, you looked at the data this morning, and of course a lot of concerns about the direction of travel in the short and long term. How, Linda, do you feel about the future data? When you look at this kind of whipsawing in the yields curve, you see very significant moves all across it. Do you think that's just a drop in the bucket compared to what's to come?
Well, no, we really think that, the whole thing is settling out after we really rocked the boat with COVID. And where should we end up kind of on the 10-year bond yield? I think it moved up to 4.6% today on the surprise CPI number. We have a 4.5% figure penciled in for this year end. So kind of getting steady, never going to probably see, or never a long time, but 2% on the 10-year, you will not see that for a very, very long time. And we've gotten so used to that. We're going to probably get used to over 4, although we will say in a volatile first half, if we should get to 5% on the 10-year during this first half, we at Federated Hermes will consider that a buying opportunity, because we don't think that we're in for big increases in CPI throughout this year.
All right, well, we're getting closer and closer to that 5%. Still some daylight there, but certainly the direction of travel is to the upside. But when it comes to the equity market, Linda, before we let you go, not a lot of time left here. What's your highest conviction? Are there any macro agnostic bets that you can make right now?
Yes, we really believe that this broadening is going to stick this year to date. The S&P is up maybe around 3%, and XMAG 7 up 6%. We've seen the manufacturing PMI go up over 50 for the first time in 26 months, which was a record. We're for big, large cap cyclical value stocks, and we really think it's going to stick this time. And not worried about a recession. If you're not worried about a recession, don't worry about the S&P 500.
Linda, we thank you so much for your views today. That is Linda Dissel of Federated Hermes. Now, coming up, White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett is joining the show following that inflation read. We're going to get a view from Washington next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Open Interest. Let's take a look at stocks about 15 minutes into the session. You can see not too pretty, but not as bad as we were at the opening bell. The S&P 500 down about 0.7%. We were looking at a 1% loss just a couple minutes ago. Same story if you take a look at the NASDAQ 100. Big tech currently down about 0.5%, and the Russell 2000 still your loss leader, down about 1.2%, but still, again, not as bad. Some of those losses coming back, Shonali, on pretty hefty volume.
But there's some signs of life under this market. One stock we are following this morning, CVS, up almost 15%. The healthcare company jumping after reporting fourth quarter profit that beat expectations. The beat, a signal of improvement for a company that has been under pressure. Here with more, Bloomberg's John Tozzi. What's going on here? Because this has been a stock that has faced some really difficult strategic challenges everywhere from management to potentially failed acquisitions. Why now are they signaling a turnaround?
Yeah, so CVS is coming off, we should say, a really rough year in 2024. This morning they reported fourth quarter earnings that were better than Wall Street expected, and they gave guidance for 2025 that was sort of in line where analysts seem to think there's room for improvement there. So, the main problem at CVS in 2024 was their Medicare Advantage insurance policies under their Aetna unit. They basically mispriced that business. Their premiums were too low. They got kind of overrun by medical expenses, and that led to pretty dramatic results.
What about the stores, though? I mean, there are people sleeping in the CVS on the corner down here, and everything is locked up, right? The stores are so run down. Is that just a New York City problem?
You need to download the app.
What's the app?
There's an app where you can just open the things.
But that doesn't change the fact that there are people, sleeping in stores and shoplifting to the point where they have to lock the toothpaste.
Yeah, I mean, I think the struggles in retail pharmacy are kind of across the industry. That's sort of a secular headwind that CVS is facing. Walgreens is also facing. I think they're, trying to figure out kind of how to respond to that. So that's like one piece of the business there.
But it's a labor issue, right? Because you just need to hire a security guard.
They have those.
Well, not doing anything, though. You need to pay one, right?
Well,
I can't speak to their strategy on that.
Is it not something, John, that they talk about? Because as a consumer, and to be fair, it's not just CVS. You make a good point. But as a consumer, it's not a pleasant experience, and now Shonali has to download the app.
I have the app. You need to download the app.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, across the healthcare industry, companies are trying to figure out how do they, particularly like CVS, Walgreens, where they have, retail footprints, like how do they they're competing with Amazon, right? They're competing with Walmart, but the kind of bigger challenge for CVS, I think, is...
John, beyond the consumer experience, what I am wondering about, there's longer-term issues here when it comes to even the U.S. government's crackdown on pharmacy benefit managers, on healthcare costs. How do they kind of work through all of those persistent pressures?
Yeah, so there have been some regulatory headwinds as well. The government under the Biden administration was sort of, the payment rates for the Medicare plans were more restricted than they had in the past. I think Wall Street is hoping for a turnaround, that there'll be kind of more money flowing into the private Medicare Advantage plans that CVS and Aetna operate. PBMs, I think it's still a question mark. We saw some some legislative movement at the end of last year to kind of increase transparency for pharmacy benefit managers. That was ultimately killed from the year-end spending bill. What comes back and where the Trump administration stands, I think, is still an open question.
John, thanks so much for joining us. Bloomberg's John Tozzi talking to us about CVS. It's a stock that we're watching today, and a story that obviously hits home for a lot of people. Not Shonali, but definitely for me. All right. Right now, I want to welcome our Bloomberg TV and radio audiences. We're going to get together here because underlying U.S. inflation last month rose by the most since March. Here to discuss the latest inflation read is Kevin Hassett, National Economic Council Director. Kevin, great to have you on. I am... Thanks. A Reagan guy. He was the first president that really caught my eye. And then I grew up reading you and when you were at the AEI, when you were writing columns for Bloomberg. So supply side economics is something that I get. But I've heard you mention a couple of times on a competing network the possibility of reducing aggregate demand in order to keep inflation down. And I'm wondering if that just means cutting government spending a la Doge, or are you really willing to slow down U.S. economic growth in order to hold prices level?
No, we're absolutely not willing to slow down economic growth, and we will not. In fact, President Trump is telling everybody that we're going to have a golden age, and we're hatching a plan to do that. But the bottom line is that, as you know, you just talked about the CPI, that the economy that we inherited from President Biden keeps looking worse and worse, so that their jobs record was revised down by 1 million jobs just a week ago. And now we're seeing that core inflation and top line inflation are really, really above the Fed's target in the latest report, which is really the last report for the Biden administration. The Trump administration has a really aggressive plan to fix the disaster that the Biden economy became. And in fact, if we go back and look, that right now it's the case that Americans are still paying something like $1,200 a month less or more for the same amount of stuff because of this inflation. And egg prices are up 100% in the Biden administration and so on. So there's a lot of work to do. But the way you get inflation down is you do micro things, and we can talk about those micro policies, like how do we address the avian flu? We're all over it. But then you do macro things too. And the macro things are to get aggregate demand, all that massive government spending, $1.5 trillion a year more than we thought it would be this year, back when we looked ahead in 2019. So you got to get that spending down, and then you got to have more supply side policies like deregulation, drilling, and tax cuts.
Well, let's talk a bit more about inflation and how you plan to address it, because a lot of people looking at these numbers are saying this doesn't even factor in the impact of tariffs here, tariffs that have just been put in place, but also potential tariffs to come. So how do you plan the administration to actually lower prices if these tariff policies come through?
Again, in the end, inflation is very much a macroeconomic phenomenon, and it depends on balancing supply and demand. And you guys might recall that when the big runaway stimulus bill that the Democrats passed was first passed, that even before inflation began, my friend John Cochran and I out at Hoover wrote an article at National Review, and we were talking on TV about how this is probably going to be about 7% inflation that year. And so it's not rocket science. It's not really hard to calculate what happens. What you have to do is have a lot of supply and reduce demand. And if you do that, prices go down. And so a big positive supply shock with more constrained government spending is going to fix the problem. But meanwhile, we're not just waiting for the macroeconomy to turn. We're also going after the micro issues one by one by increasing energy supply, reducing regulations that are very costly, and even going after, again, very targeted things like what are we going to do about the fact that Joe Biden last year killed 130 million chickens, and that's why egg prices are so high. We're putting together a plan to manage the avian flu in a much wiser way. And so we've got an all of the above approach on inflation. And so this bad number, just remember, is closing the books on what Biden has done, which is allow inflation to get out of control. And the Biden people that he chose are also, complicit in this. You might have looked that Austin Goolsbee, the Chicago Fed president, just gave a speech a couple days ago saying, hey, inflation's under control. And here we see that we're looking at a 3-month moving average above 4, right? So that's not what the Fed should be saying right now. And it's not true, but we're going to fix it, with or without the Fed, because we understand macroeconomics.
You do have the president talking about wanting lower rates, but when you do have inflation as it stands well above the Fed's target persistently, and an increase in many aspects of the American economy as well, how would you then lower rates into this environment? Wouldn't that be considered imprudent given where inflation stands today?
It goes back to actually proving what we were just talking about. If you go back and look at what's happened to the 10-year yield since Treasury Secretary has been there, since Doge has started to make real progress cutting spending, then we've gone down. We went up. We're up 11 today on the bad inflation news, which is backward-looking. A Biden failure, but we're still many, many basis points ahead over the last week and a half, where there's all this positive spending news. And so I think that, instead of 409, we're at 464 looking at your screen. And all that progress is the early first few week progress of these policies that we're talking about. And so interest rates can come in Treasury markets.
Well, it doesn't look like Powell is going to be lowering interest rates. I mean, how can they if inflation...
Right now, I think that all economists have, after lots of study, agreed that it's the sort of 5-year to 10 down is a big positive for growth that's non-inflationary. And so to see 10-year coming down the way it has after we've announced our policies is exactly what markets should expect. And as you see with the speaker today, I think, actually, I haven't looked at the afternoon schedule yet, and we were talking to Lindsey Graham yesterday. It looks like budget deals are really moving forward. When all that positive news starts to influence markets, then they'll respond favorably, is my expectation, and interest rates will come down, because instead of spending $1.5 trillion a year more than we thought we'd be spending back in 2019 when we looked ahead to this year, we're going to be spending a lot less. And one of the interesting things is that we're finding all of this wasteful spending through DOGE that nobody else in the Biden administration was looking at. And they were just spending money willy-nilly, throwing we find. And now we're shutting that down, and Treasury markets are responding already positively. And
a Basel III endgame approach, just speaking on behalf of the Fed only, not the other supervisors, and that it be take into account the comments and that it be generally capital neutral?
We do intend to repropose Basel III Endgame, and we intend to do that just as soon as we can get together with the new leadership at the two other banking agencies. And as I mentioned, I think we can do that pretty promptly once those people are in place. I look forward to doing that. My long-held view, as I've said in many of these hearings, is that capital in the banking system for the largest banks is at about right. And that would be my starting point on going into these discussions. But I do want to defer. I do want to leave it for my upcoming, new leadership at those agencies to have their own views on that.
I think that's important. I think it needs to be coordinated and harmonized among our supervisory agencies. And I do want you to take into account how Basel III endgame proposal interacts with other pending rules, whether they're on liquidity or the other things like operating risk in the companies. I think that was a lot of centrality of the comments that we saw on your Barr proposal. Turning to monetary policy, looking back at 2020 and 2021, I was looking at all the principal monetary policy rules that you report in your semi-annual report. And had you followed any of the monetary policy rules that you track, they would have had you tighten sooner in the cycle rather than waiting. And I think that could have reflected, maybe not seen us have a 40-year high in inflation. Using the benefit of hindsight, do you think you should have looked at those rules more closely in the open market operations and tightened sooner?
I will say, and I've said before, that hindsight suggests that it would have been good if we had tightened earlier. I don't know how much difference that would have made, but I'd be very careful with those rules. Those rules, those rules in the middle of last year suggested that our policy rate was a couple hundred basis points too high. So we need to. They're a starting point, not an ending point. Is
right. But we've had this conversation before. The point is that they do offer a roadmap, and you do mention them in writing in your monetary policy reports, except for one time during the pandemic. And I think, though, that you're adding that to your reference point in your forward guidance and in your communications, I think would be important. Can you tell us about the review of the inflation targeting and when you expect to complete that?
Expect to complete it by the late in the summer this year. We're just beginning it now, and we're going to look at all the decisions that we made, why we made them back in 2020. We're going to ask ourselves what's changed. We're going to be open to criticism and good ways of thinking about it, and I think we'll make appropriate, discrete adjustments.
I thank you for being with us today, and I turn to the ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. Waters, for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It is no secret that President Trump, that he wants to do away with the Federal Reserve altogether. He said he knows interest rates much better than you do. I want you to know that some of us here have been fighting to make sure that everybody understands the importance of the central bank. Every country dealing with crypto, their central bank is involved. But, of course, Trump and the opposite side of the aisle fought us. And that's one of the reasons we were not able to come together with a bipartisan agreement on stablecoins. You previously said that you would not resign if Trump asked you to do that. Do you stand by that commitment?
I have no changes to that.
I can't hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. Please let the record record that adequately. I appreciate that because you have a right to your position not to be interfered with by law, I believe, or even Constitution. When Musk comes knocking at the Fed's door, are you going to let him in?
I don't have anything for you on that.
Would you like to tell us today that you won't let Doge into the Federal Reserve or have access to the systems and the data?
So I don't have any, we've had no contact, and I don't really have, I have nothing for you to report today on that.
Well, you know what happened at Treasury, and you know what happened over at the CFPB, and the people of this country are being violated because all of our privacy is being taken up by Elon Musk and Trump, and we don't know what all they have on us, our bank accounts, everything that in our lives. So I want to protect it in the Fed. Mr. Powell, the last time you testified before this committee, you said, and I quote, "Really successful institutions in the United States generally are those that do a really good job on diversity and get the best out of people and attract a broad, diverse range of talents to the table. That is the way we feel about it. And at the Fed, and that is what we've been doing and will continue to do." Chair Powell, how will you ensure that the Fed continues to attract the best and most diverse employees?
You know, we're institutions like ours, private and public, are in a constant contest to hire the best talent in the country. And we've all learned, I think, and certainly we have, that we will go anywhere to find that talent, and including places that we didn't go 25 years ago. And we'll just continue to do that. You know, we're recruiting, as you know, at many, many, many universities and colleges, including historically black universities and colleges, and others. And that's what we find, and that's our practice. We think that's the best way to go about it.
Thank you very much, and that's what I've always felt about the Fed. No matter what they call it, you only attracted and hired the best qualified people in your operation, no matter what they refer to it as, what they call it, whatever way they define it. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Chair Powell, are you willing to provide my staff with an immediate briefing from your agency on the status of your OMWEs and equal employment offices?
Yes.
Thank you. I believe that you know that the OMWEs were created with the Dodd-Frank reforms. It's in law. And as I understand it, any attempt to dismantle OMWEs would have to come before the Congress of the United States of America. Is that your understanding?
Well, yes. Section 342 of Dodd-Frank, which is the OMWE section, is the law.
Thank you. Chair Powell, to what extent have you consulted with other board members in determining how your agency is complying with Section 342 of Dodd-Frank, and as well as any other federal anti-discrimination law?
I think we've consulted with senior staff and board members quite a bit.
Chair Powell, days after his inauguration, President Trump issued an executive order on digital assets, which includes a prohibition on central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. The executive order banned any, quote, form of digital money or monetary value denominated in the national unit of account that is a direct liability of central bank, end quote. I'm concerned that this extremely broad definition could go far beyond CBDCs. Well, thank you very much. My time is up, but I appreciate your presence here today, and I appreciate your willingness to stand up for your right
Gentlewoman's
to be the
time
chair.
has expired.
And I now yield back. Thank you.
But I do invite the chairman to respond to the gentlewoman's question on CBDCs in writing. And now we turn to the vice chair of the full committee, Bill Huizenga, the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chair Powell. Good to see you again. You had talked a little bit about your review. I'm going to start there. Obviously, a lot has changed in the last 5 years: pandemic, inflation, higher interest rates, to name a few. However, I believe your dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices should remain the ultimate objective. I assume you agree with that. I'd let the record reflect slight head nod on that, I guess. This committee is going to be very focused on monetary policy, and with my good friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, chairing a task force that I'm happy to be a part of, we're going to be addressing some of those issues. Chair Hill touched on some of the rules that have been discussed. I, for one, have always been particular to Taylor rule, but there's a number of rules. I know you go through those. At one point, I suggested that we could call it the Yellen rule with Chair Yellen. But there needed to be some sort of public declaration of what to benchmark against, and I still feel that that is of some importance. You outlined your timeline on this particular review, but I'm curious, do you believe that the last policy framework limited the Fed's response to raising inflation, something that you and I have talked about over the years?
No. I'll tell you why we didn't raise rates. We thought the inflation was transitory. I can show you forecasts from the end of 2021 by us, by staff, by the blue chip. Everybody thought it was going to be transitory. That's why we didn't raise rates.
And I also distinctly remember a hearing where you and Secretary Yellen at the time were sitting next to each other, and it looked like you visibly scooted away when I asked you both whether it was still transitory, and you had, for the first time ever, a separate answer. Her answer was yes, it still was transitory. You gave a very Fed speak answer of, we no longer believe the data shows that. So no. And to kind of go to Chair Hill's point, we think that might have been a little late on that. On back to the review, I'm curious, what sort of input are you looking for from the public and from Congress as you go into that review?
So from the public, we'll do a series of Fed Listens events, which were very successful the last time. And it involves us sitting down and meeting with people, some of whom know a lot about what the Fed does, some of whom just tell you what's going on in their communities. It was really, it was a very successful part of our outreach last time. In terms of Congress, you know, we'll keep you informed of our progress. We welcome anything you may offer. But you know, it's a public. We're open to the public on this. It's a public review, as distinct from what we were doing before, and so we're welcoming views from all over.
And not to get ahead of the chairman, but I look forward to us having more conversations about that with the working group. I want to switch topics and focus a bit back to the bank supervision. Michael Barr has stepped down from his position as vice chair for supervision effective at the end of the month. And whether, frankly, President Trump fills that position is entirely up to him. But in the absence of a vice chair for supervision, you're still working, I think, on it. I think your quote to the chairman was, there's no time for a holiday. Now, this vice chair of supervision is a Fed governor that has, frankly, extraordinary powers and responsibilities. And ultimately, my question to you is, does the Fed really need a separate vice chair to complete its work? Now, I got here in after the 2010 election, 2011, shortly after Dodd-Frank was passed. I know this vice chair position was created by Dodd-Frank. I've just been dealing with the echo effects now for the last going on 15 years of Dodd-Frank. Do we really need to have a separate vice chair of supervision?
So for many years, as you know, we did our business without a vice chair for supervision. What that means is everything goes through the full board.
And it was effective?
I think it was, and also there was less volatility.
Explain that. Why was there less volatility?
Well, because you've got a group of 7 people on the board, and there will be some as appointments change. There'll be some changes in the approach to regulation, but putting it all in a single person, admittedly just to recommend to the board, can lead to sort of some volatility in these things, which is really
larger swings in policy.
Larger swings in the kind of things, and that's not great for the institutions that we want to regulate. We want to have a good set of regulation that doesn't swing back and forth very much. The question of whether it's a good thing to have in the law is really one for you. But I will tell you, we will. Once Vice Chair Barr completes his term in a few weeks, we will continue on until there's a new Vice Chair for supervision, and we can very much get our work done.
Or if there is one. So with that, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
I thank the Vice Chairman. Mr. Huizenga yields back. Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes of questions.
Chairman Powell, you are the only bipartisan person or thing left in Washington. You were appointed by Obama. Trump gave you a promotion, Biden reappointed you, and you are the only Biden appointee not to hear the words, "You're fired," from our president. So I hope we listen to what you have to say, because you're the only person or that I can identify in Washington that has support on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Huizenga mentions the importance of your dual mandate. Project 2025 calls for abolishing the dual mandate and eliminating a mandate that you focus on employment. if we were to give you just one mandate dealing with price stability and take away the mandate on employment, over the next 10 years, would our GDP be higher or lower?
It wouldn't be possible for me to say.
Does the fact that you focus on employment as one of your dual mandates lead to lower unemployment, higher employment in our country?
It may do so. We do balance those things. To some extent, that may be right.
Chair Hill spoke about how important it is that you maintain your independence. I noticed that in light of the hiring freeze, the Fed has removed all its job postings. I'm hoping that your personnel policy will be as independent as everything else at the Fed. But I'm more concerned with the president's statement at 7:58 this morning, where he said interest rates should be lowered. He said it. Will that influence what the Fed actually does?
As a practice, never comment on anything the president says, but I think people can be confident that we'll continue to keep our heads down, do our work, make our decisions based on what's happening in the economy, the outlook,
and
the balance
statements
of risks.
by elected officials are not among the things that cause you to act one way or the other.
That's correct.
Thank you. And he went on to say, he said interest rates should be lowered, something which would go hand in hand with upcoming tariffs. Let's rock and roll America. I certainly agree with the rock and roll America, but the Peterson Institute says that the policies that the president ran on will raise the CPI by between 4 and 7.5 points. And I think the biggest element of that is the proposed tariffs. If we have higher tariffs across the board, say 10 to 25%, would that increase the cost of living? And would an increase in the CPI or related indexes of the cost of living lead to higher interest rates?
You know, there are many organizations, public and private, whose role is to speculate publicly about what this might be. What we're doing is we're reserving judgment until we actually know what the policies are.
But if we have a higher cost of living, does that lead to higher interest rates? The CPI goes up, or CPE, excuse me?
Well, if inflation goes up in general, forget about tariffs. In general, of course, we will use our tools, which is the interest rate, to bring it back down to 2% over time.
Okay. Yesterday, you told the Senate we're going to release the stress test scenarios before we implement them. Will you take a holistic look at large bank capital requirements, including the risk-based capital ratios like Basel III Endgame, stress testing, to make sure that you don't have a contraction in the ability of credit to Main Street businesses?
Yes.
Great. There's a proposal in Project 2025 that we abolish Fannie and Freddie. If there was no explicit or implicit federal guarantee for those who invest in mortgages, would that lead to higher mortgage interest rates?
Since you'd no longer be borrowing on the credit of the United States, in other words, so Fannie and Freddie would be privately funded, it could lead to that. I think privatizing Freddie and Fannie might have other virtues too, though, as has been considered many times by this committee and others.
Might have some virtues, but it would lead to higher mortgage rates.
It could.
The CFPB has been put on ice, but all the regulations remain in force. So if you're a bank that wants to comply with those regulations, there's nobody that can give you any clarification. So you don't know. And if you're a bank that doesn't want to comply, the next presidential election may put into practice a CFPB that enforces all the regulations that the Trump administration has tried to eliminate. Does that cause confusion for banks?
You're speculating about what the situation might be. I would say that it could. Yeah.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Chair Powell, let's talk about the balance sheet. As we've discussed several times before, the consistent and massive growth of the federal debt creates long-run challenges for both the United States and saddles future generations with an onerous burden. But it also creates a challenging environment for the markets as the Treasury market expands in kind. As the Fed engages in quantitative tightening, allowing the treasuries to roll off, the Fed is careful to ensure that there are ample reserves for the balance sheet. Could you briefly discuss the conditions that determine the ideal level of reserves?
Sure. So let me say that we intend to slow, and we have slowed, but then stop the process of shrinking our balance sheet at a time when we think that reserves are somewhat above the level that we judge to be consistent with our ample reserves framework. So what that means is we want reserves to be ample, meaning we don't want them to suddenly appear to be shortages of reserves. So we're going to think of where those shortages might appear, and we're going to put a buffer on top of that, because nothing good happens when there's not enough liquidity. So that's our overall framework. And right now, we feel like all the evidence suggests that reserves are still abundant, which is more than ample.
As you know, in early 2021, the Fed stated that it would invite comments on the supplemental leverage ratio. That has not happened yet. I've made the point that the growth of the U.S. Treasury market paired with a decreased willingness of banks to act as intermediaries is a major issue on the horizon. When former Treasury Secretary Yellen was before this committee last year, I asked her about the resiliency of the Treasury market, specifically about the wisdom of permanently modifying the SLR. She said it's something that the banking regulator should consider. Does the Fed plan to finally look at the SLR?
Yes, I believe we will. I have, for a long time, like others, been somewhat concerned about the levels of liquidity in the Treasury market. The amount of Treasuries has grown much faster than the intermediation capacity has grown, and one obvious thing to do is to reduce the effective supplemental leverage ratio, the bindingness of it. So that's something I do expect we will return to and work on with our new colleagues at the other agencies and get done.
Because I think my colleagues are aware that over the course of recent times, literally we have 8 times as much debt to process, but only half as many major market makers. The Federal Reserve is not immune to politics. You, like every Fed governor, go through a lengthy confirmation process in the Senate. And of course, you're required to answer to Congress in hearings like this. I can trace a major political turning point at the Fed to the passage of Dodd-Frank, which greatly expanded the Fed's regulation and supervision authority. Chairman Powell, do you worry that the independence of the Federal Reserve's monetary policy function is in any way hindered by its role as a bank regulator? Can you do both?
Well, we can and we do, and we'll continue to do that. Clearly, the regulatory and supervisory side is more contentious in political circles. But we will continue to carry it out as best we can, and to do so in a non-political way as best we can.
And clearly that'll be a major discussion topic in the task force. In my remaining time, could you discuss the Fed's 5-year review of monetary policy? What are the categories of issues you think that will be helpful to receive feedback on?
So a good part of it will be looking at the changes we made in 2020, which were made in an environment where we had been stuck at the effective lower bound at 0 for 7 years. And the highest we got our rate really was sustainably was 1.5%, and that was the highest of any advanced economy central bank. So the concern was that at the slightest downturn, we'd be back at the 0 lower bound and we'd be stuck. So we were looking for ways to make up for that. So then the question is, we got this inflation out of the pandemic and the events related to it. Are we in a different place now? And I think the chances are pretty good that maybe the effective lower bound is still a concern, but it's not the base case anymore. So we need to look at that and decide how what are the implications of that for our framework.
Thank you, Chairman, and I look forward to several more discussions on these topics. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, thank you for being here today, and you've indicated in past hearings that geopolitical tensions pose important risks to global economic activity. In fact, around this time last year when you appeared before the committee, you and I discussed how conflicts around the world, specifically the war in Ukraine, had impacted the cost of things like groceries in the United States of America. At that time, you indicated that the war had caused commodity prices to move sharply back home. Does that sound correct to you, if I'm familiar to you?
Yes, it does.
So, just to reiterate, in this interconnected world that we live in, would it be safe to say that economic instability in other countries has the potential to impact economic factors here in the United States?
Sometimes, yes.
And so, given that fact, would it seem like a smart move for the United States government to remove one of our most effective strategic tools that, by mandate, assist U.S. commercial interests by supporting developing countries' economic growth and building countries' capacity to participate in the world trade? Would you agree with that?
It's not for me to be the judge or to say on that.
Well, we do know that a number of, like USAID, they buy a lot of their agricultural products, et cetera, from American farmers. And in fact, it helps the U.S. economy when you look at the volume of agricultural products that are being bought so that we can continue to be a part of the rest of the world. Would that be correct?
As far as I know, yes.
So, you know, today we find ourselves facing a situation where the president and his Dodge buddy Elon Musk seem hell-bent on dismantling USAID, no matter the consequences, even if they are dire. To me, the assault on this congressionally authorized body represents an attack on the rule of law and should outrage every member of this body. Every member, Democrats and Republicans alike. And I know that your interest is squarely within your dual mandate and not foreign policy. I sit on both committees. I'm here, but I'm also the ranking member on the Foreign Policy Committee. And so I can't sit here today and pretend that what we're doing won't impact employment and economic stability right here in the United States of America. Weakening USAID will fuel global crises, endanger American security, embolden other nations like China and Russia, and leave us here in the Trump administration solely responsible for the fallout. So I have to take this opportunity to urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to also stand up for USAID. Anytime we travel, we go visit what they do. We go visit the good that they do. We go visit what their and how their economies improve so that they can be part of the global economy. So, if not because people just care about the rest of the world, then because we care about our country and recognize that instability elsewhere threatens our stability right here. It is extremely important in an interconnected world because the economy is interconnected around the world. We cannot isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Chairman Powell, welcome. We're delighted to be here, and I hope that this comes with greetings from every single member that we appreciate and respect you taking the time, even though you're expected here. We think you show up, and we admire you. Mr. Chairman, you and I both know that way back when, and we assume 21,
that there was a decision made by the Fed that gets close to quantitative easing and then the term tapering. And we know that it was sold as a monetary stimulus to help the country, and I get that. There was about, in my opinion, $2.33 trillion that were taken out in loans. And Chairman just spoke a minute ago about the term debt versus growth. Debt versus growth, about this amount of money that sits out there on the debt side. Could you please take a minute and discuss this issue and how we should be looking at it? Thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Sessions, are we talking about asset purchases that we made during the...
We are. We're talking about when the Fed went and sold treasuries.
No, we bought treasuries.
Bought treasuries.
Yeah, we bought treasuries. So, you know, it was a situation, I'll tell you why we did it. You know, we were just out of the worst part of the pandemic, and we didn't know how, frankly, how good things were going to be, how strong the economy. We were very concerned. COVID is still raging, and it actually, you know, had a very strong wave right into 22. But we wanted to just, we didn't want to stop buying treasuries too soon, because I mean that has a stimulative effect on the economy, because we didn't want to provoke an unwanted tightening in financial conditions at a time when we thought the economy was still vulnerable. If you look back in hindsight, we probably could have done that earlier and halted purchase earlier. In any case, we turned right around and started shrinking the balance sheet, and
you moved it from about 120 a month to 110.
Well, we're down now. We've been tapering for 2 years now, and we're down more than $2 trillion. So, and we're still going. We're still going. So that's why we did what we did.
Tell me what that looks like in the longer term aggregate versus with what the chairman said, debt versus growth, because we believe the debt remains and the growth is not equaling that ability to pay it back.
So what happens is we borrow money to cover the spending that Congress has done. Our purchases don't affect that. We're basically issuing reserves, which is cash, and we're retiring Treasury securities. And the effect of that is to drive down long-term rates. That's the whole reason for QE.
And what are you paying for those long-term rates?
Market rates. We're paying exactly the market.
And what would that market be approximately a year ago or to now?
Well, you know, the 10-year, we're not, of course, we're going in the other direction now. We're shrinking now, but we are buying, you know, the 10-year was yielding a very, very low yield on it. Was quite low during the pandemic, extremely low, because, you know, growth was slow. There was a lot of demand for treasuries. So we were pushing down rates to support economic activity. When you can't lower your policy rate anymore and you want to do more stimulus, that's really the main thing you can do. It's actually the forefather of that was Milton Friedman, who came up with that thought way back in the past. But that's what we did. And then, as I mentioned, we turned around as soon as we lifted off and started raising rates. We immediately started shrinking the balance sheet, and we've shrunk it a lot, $2 trillion and still counting.
You have shrunk it $2 trillion?
Yes, we have.
Okay. And what do you believe remains, and you believe you're now stable for moving forward?
So I think we have a ways to go. Actually, the level of reserves, which is the thing we're focused on, hasn't really changed. All of that has come out of what's called the overnight reverse repo facility. I'd be happy to spend some time with you on this. This stuff is very complicated. And
yes, I've tried to find new data on it, and the last I found really was a CRS report of 22. So what's
very big
127.22, and so the changes that you speak of are important.
Yeah.
And so I would appreciate that time.
Be happy to do that.
Great. I want to thank you for being here. The confidence that the American people have that we will turn not just the economics of their lives, but of the country is very important. And I today spoke about the country. And I want to thank you for your service and time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and welcome, Chair Powell. Chair Powell, I'm worried about these tariffs. And I want you to kind of share with us your thoughts on these tariffs. I'm worried about, I think the president is wrong here. Tariffs can cause a terrible situation to the economy. I'm concerned about the inflationary impact on tariffs. And where cost increases from the tariffs, there's a cost to these tariffs. And we need not move into this area blindly. And some of these costs will be absorbed by business companies, but there are other costs that will be borne by the American consumers. We don't even understand this. And yet you have the president just using these tariffs as a means of fight or like a war. And this is going to do it. Everybody is not going to be Mexico or Canada. And while we got a little time, I want your thoughts on the dangers of these tariffs. The stock market is anticipating rate cuts. What will these tariffs do about that? Does the Fed see financial market stability as a factor in its decision-making process when considering the rate cuts? And here is specifically what I want you to get to. In light of the president, and politely I will say, his ill-crafted tariff strategy, do you foresee future rate cuts as a result of inflationary issues or due to a weaker labor market? And what do you consider to be promising inflation data? That's our big fight. And these tariffs are going to just add to inflation like a rocket ship. Your thoughts?
So,
and share with us, give us your opinion of the danger of these. There's a cost here. Tell us what you think about this.
The president has certain authorities over tariffs. Congress has authorities over tariffs. The Commerce Department is involved in some ways, but the Fed has no role in setting tariffs. And we don't comment on decisions made by those who do have that authority. We try to stick to our own knitting. In this particular case, it's possible that the economy would evolve in ways that, because of tariffs, or partly because of tariffs, that we would need to do something with our policy rate. But we can't know what that is until we actually know what policies are enacted. And remember, it's not just tariffs. There are significant changes to immigration policy, fiscal policy, and also regulatory policy. You put all four of those, and all four of those were things that the president was elected to do. We will then try to make an intelligent judgment about the overall effect on the economy of those, and conduct our policy accordingly. But it's not our role in any way to comment on the wisdom of the policies that are enacted by Congress or by the administration.
Will he have an effect on whether or not you will resume your plan to cut the interest rates this year or continue to hold?
So we'll make our decisions as we go about what to do with interest rates based on the data that we see, the outlook, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. And we'll be considering all of those things. We won't be focusing on any particular policy, and I can't tell you what we'll be doing, because it will really depend. It's a fairly uncertain environment right now.
Yeah.
The underlying economy is very strong, but there's some uncertainty out there about new policies. We're just going to have to wait and see what the effects of those policies are before we think about what we can do.
Well, all I want to say, God bless you. I know your strength. We've worked together over the years on many things, and this nation is grateful that we have you, your wisdom and intellect at this time.
I agree, but the gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner.
I thank the chair, and it's good to see you again, Chairman Powell. Chair Powell, under the Biden administration, American families were hit with a huge stealth tax from, as we've spoken about, inflation that drove up grocery prices and led to high rates on things like mortgages and car loans. Since 2021, the average Missouri household is paying about $1,100 more per month due to inflation. To put that number into perspective, the median family income in Missouri is $69,000. These families have had to spend $13,000 more of their annual income on the exact same goods. What specifically is the Federal Reserve's plan for making life easier for everyday Americans?
So the best thing we can do for Americans is to vigorously pursue both stable prices and maximum employment. We're trying to get back to a long expansion where prices are stable around 2%.
You seem to be there on labor, as you've pointed out, so tell me what else?
Sorry?
You seem to be there on labor, so what else?
You know, I would say we're close but not there on inflation. And you did see today's inflation print, which says the same thing. I mean, we've made great progress toward 2%. Last year, inflation was 2.6%. So great progress, but we're not quite there yet. So we want to keep policy restrictive for now so that we can see.
We're definitely not there for 30-year mortgages, you know, upwards of 7%, Chair Powell. So let me switch topics. I continue to believe that, as we've spoken about and as was brought up prior colleagues here, that the federal banking agencies, including the Federal Reserve, should scrap the flawed Basel III endgame proposal and start over. You talked a little bit about how you plan to perhaps do that, and a timeline potentially. But how will the public, Chair Powell, be able to provide comments on any revised proposal as required by the Administrative Procedures Act?
So I fully expect, and I think it's a good idea for the United States to finish Basel III in a way that's, you know, in keeping with Basel and also with what other jurisdictions are doing, comparable jurisdictions.
The key there is end game. This has been going on for 2 decades.
Where's the end already, right? So, you know, we'll put all of that out for comment again and welcome the comments for all commenters.
I should make sure we're following the Administrative Procedure Act.
Oh, yes.
As you move forward.
We will.
Chair Powell, I understand you are interested in making the stress test scenarios that assess how a bank will perform through a crisis more transparent. As things stand now, while the Fed may make some information public, it doesn't show its math, which makes it difficult to assess the robustness and analytical rigor of the stress tests. Recently, the Federal Reserve announced that due to the, quote, evolving legal landscape, it would begin to take public comment on its stress test models and annual scenarios. Can you describe the changes in the legal landscape that have caused the Federal Reserve to suddenly seek public comment on its stress test regime and why it did not seek public comment from the beginning?
So we're an agency that's strongly committed to following the law as written by Congress and as interpreted by the Supreme Court. In the past few years, we've seen a string of administrative law cases from the Supreme Court which are dealing with different issues, but there's a common theme, and that is significantly less deference to the views of agencies as compared to those of courts. Also just raised expectations for compliance with the Administrative Procedures Act. We take that very much to heart. And this is one of the things that we're doing because of that. And we feel the appropriate.
You can look at things like Chevron deference. You can look at the EPA ruling by the courts, and they are returning the power back to the people and the Congress, not the administrative state, not those agencies and rulemakers.
So because of those things, you know, we are putting, as you went through it, we're putting the models and and everything else out for comment and taking similar steps.
Well, I'm glad to see that. I understand the Fed intends to complete a comprehensive review of its monetary policy strategy, tools, and communications practices. You mentioned that. What is the timeline?
We expect to complete our work and announce the results by the end of the summer.
End of the summer. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Chair Powell. Good to see you. Thank you for your good work. Chairman Powell, the Senate just filed a bill called the Genius Act. I'm always worried about anything that comes over from the Senate with the title Genius in it. But it is an attempt to provide a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency. And in that proposal, which is similar in some respects to the House proposal, it would allow individual states to oversee issuers, and there would be no central federal authority. The idea is to disperse the responsibility from state to state. My concern, my overriding concern, is that with that spread of and expansion of crypto, and the president is 100% behind it. He just started his own meme coin. He's making a lot of money off of that, which is another issue. My concern is that the spread of an expansion of crypto will infect the traditional banking system because it's a volatile, speculative asset, and we've seen some very sudden disasters with crypto. I'm just wondering, are there any backstops that we can use, any firewalls that we can put in place that might insulate the traditional banking system, you know, because they have access to the discount window and they're FDIC insured. So there may be, you know, second order impacts if we have a collapse of a major crypto issuer. Are there any extra things that we can do to protect the traditional banking system?
Yes. So first, I would say there are really two things that are happening. One is banks are serving crypto customers, and we don't want to get in the way of banks serving perfectly legal customers as long as they understand the risks and that sort of thing. We don't want to single out any particular.
Are you speaking to custody?
Well, custody is more, the second thing is undertaking activities on their own, right? And in that case, I do think it's appropriate to you know, as usual, as bank supervisors, make sure that we understand and banks understand the risks that are involved in the activity that they're taking inside an insured depository. On the other hand, you don't want to go too far. You know, I think there were a bunch of disasters, as we all remember, and, you know, we don't want to, and we were reacting to some extent to those. You don't want to go so far as to, you know, overplay your hand on that. So I think we need to be mindful that many of these activities can very well be done inside of banks, and custody may well be one of them. In fact, in Fed-regulated banks, there are lots of crypto activities happening now. They've just happened under a framework where we made sure that the bank understood and we understood exactly what they're doing.
Right. We also have the example of, you know, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, First Republic Bank. One of the triggering events there. I mean, obviously the risk management was very poor in that respect, and they got on the wrong side of interest rates. But there were also some failures of issuers who had huge deposits at Silicon Valley, I believe, or Signature, or maybe both of them. And the suddenness of their collapse caused a run for the exits. And luckily, with the scramble, we were able to sort of save that situation so it didn't create a greater contagion. But are there steps that we can take that might strengthen our ability to respond to that type of collapse as well?
Yes. So in the wake of Silicon Valley Bank, we did work with many medium and sized banks that had any of the characteristics that we saw. And you mentioned, a long position in long-term securities that was underwater, along with a very unstable deposit base made up mostly of uninsured deposits. And in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, it was a lot of similar private equity and venture capital and hedge fund companies where they all just pulled their money out at the same time. So it was a bank run, and bank runs are very destructive whenever they happen. So we looked for that pattern. We worked with companies who had any aspect of that pattern, and we were successful, I think, in not having that crisis spread very broadly, and that was a good thing. Looking forward, though, we need to not forget that lesson and make sure that funding bases are stable and that we're focused on the basics of banking, which is credit risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Powell, let me ask you a quick monetary policy question and then turn to bank regulation and Treasury market structure. I know hindsight is 20/20, but it's important to learn from mistakes, as you know, and you've conceded that the Fed miscalculated on inflation and mischaracterized inflation as transitory in 2021-2022 time period. Given that inflation remains stuck above the Fed's 2% target, will you commit to scrapping the flexible average inflation targeting framework? And if not, why wouldn't you commit to returning just to a simple 2% target?
So we're just beginning the review. It'll be done, as I mentioned, by the end of the summer, and that's the exact question we'll be asking. I can't commit to a particular outcome. I need to respect the process and the views of the other 18 participants on the FOMC.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I just hope that in that process that you and your colleagues recognize that framework allowed rising inflation to persist and allowed the Fed to mislabel it as transitory. Let me turn to bank regulation. In October of last year, I led a bipartisan CODEL to Basel, Switzerland, met with the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, and there the committee actually conceded to us, agreed with me that the Michael Barr proposal of July 2023 actually gold-plated bank capital requirements, and instead of actually promoting international harmonization, actually made American banks less competitive. They conceded that to us. So I applaud the Fed for not moving forward on that July 2023 proposal that would have made it harder for large banks to, among other things, facilitate the smooth functioning of the U.S. Treasury market, including holding treasuries on the balance sheet. Couple questions. One is, should the goal of our bank capital rules, should it be regulatory harmonization internationally, or should it be American economic competitiveness?
I mean, clearly, the goal is to have a strong banking system that supports American economic activity and growth. That's the ultimate goal. What you get from Basel is a global floor so that the other banks can't run on less capital and sort of have a short-term advantage. That was the whole point of Basel, was to get everybody to the same kind of level so that there wouldn't be the race to the bottom.
And I see that utility, but I think the goal of our regulatory system should be America first, and it should be about American economic growth and competitiveness. But let's talk about the Treasury market issues. Obviously, we're issuing a ton of debt right now. In fact, according to BlackRock, we're issuing $573 billion of Treasury bonds every week. To put that in perspective, the entire national debt of Australia is $573 billion. So we're issuing Australia every week in this country, if you want to think of it that way. Would reducing excessive capital and liquidity requirements on U.S. banks for intermediating U.S. Treasury market take the heat off of U.S. capital markets and increase Treasury market liquidity and stability?
I strongly think it would help.
Well, I think that's especially an important comment in terms of your regulatory approach, because, as you know, maturing bonds were being financed at an average of near zero during COVID, and now they're about double the cost of the average of about 3.5%. So now is not the time to make it more difficult for banks to hold treasuries. Let me just drill down with a little bit more detail on this Treasury market structure issue. Do you agree that the supplementary leverage ratio and the enhanced supplemental leverage ratio, the ESLR, are problematic as they create a disincentive for banks, especially large banks, broker-dealer affiliates, to serve as intermediators in the primary, secondary, and repo markets for U.S. Treasury securities?
I do.
And so you would commit to reviewing the SLR framework to create greater capacity for our banks to provide liquidity in the Treasury market?
I think it's time to move on the ESLR. And, you know, we proposed doing so several years ago. We just didn't follow through on it. So I do think it's time.
Well, thank you for that. And finally, yesterday, during your appearance in front of the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Warren asked you about the future of consumer protection laws if the CFPB is abolished. Isn't it true, Chairman Powell, that prior to Dodd-Frank, consumer protection laws were implemented by financial institutions' primary prudential regulators?
Yes.
And so if there were a decision by the Congress and DOJ or whatever to repeal the CFPB, we could return the consumer protection law enforcement function to other financial regulators.
You could, yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well, and would like to associate myself with the comments of the ranking member. And Mr. Powell, I would like to compliment you for standing up to the president, for literally preserving the independence of the Fed. It was one of those pivotal moments in time. It would have been more than your simply resigning. It would have been the president taking control of the Fed with one of his Pluto puppets. Mr. Powell, I'd like to speak to you now about the process of collecting tariffs. When the tariff is collected, at what point does that actually happen? If we impose a tariff, product is coming into the country, where is that tariff collected?
Great question. I'm not an expert on that. I'm going to say the Customs Bureau collects it, but I stand to be corrected by anyone who.
I believe you're correct. That's what my research reveals. Permit me to extend this. When it is collected, it goes into a coffer. I believe we call that coffer the general fund. Is this correct?
I don't know, actually.
It does. The tariff goes into the general fund. A tariff is another way of saying tax, I believe, for many people. Is that a fair statement?
It is sometimes characterized as a tax.
So if the president imposes a tariff, which is a tax, and the tax is collected by some entity before it actually, on the product before it gets into the country, then the president is putting tax dollars into a general fund such that they may at some point, and these dollars, by the way, are coming from the consumer, at some point they may be used to cover some of the appropriations of this very House that the president has enormous control over. So in a sense, what the president can do is aid with the payment of what he would call a tax break, but aid with putting dollars in the pockets of his billionaire buddies that he collects on the tariff that the people in this country ultimately have to cover. I think that the president, while he seems to always avoid the question of how the tariffs are going to be dispersed, he knows that he can at some point use that money to help pay the taxes that he plans to return to his billionaire buddies. I think that's a very sinister way of doing business, to require the consumer to fund tax breaks. I think this president knows what he's doing. I think he believes that the very wealthy need more to do more, and that the poor can do more with less. I don't agree with it, and I will do all that I can to prevent it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And over here, Mr. Powell, thank you. Good to see you.
How are you?
All right. The Federal Reserve recently withdrew from the network for greening the financial system, stating that its work had extended beyond the Fed's statutory mandate. While I agree with this decision, I still have concerns with how previous Fed policies may have discouraged lending to traditional energy sectors like oil and gas, and it should not be the role of the government and the Federal Reserve to be in the business of picking winners and losers. So my question is, can you clarify whether the Fed will ensure that financial institutions are not pressured to making lending decisions based on political or climate considerations rather than sound financial risk analysis?
I confirm that is not our policy. That would be inappropriate, and absolutely not something we should be doing.
Okay, thank you. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision intended for the Basel III Endgame proposal changes to be implemented in a capital-neutral manner to ensure a level playing field for U.S. banks. Following this intent, the previous Federal Reserve Vice Chair for Supervision initiated implementation efforts with capital neutrality in mind. However, his successor politicized the process, imposing harsher requirements that exceeded BS recommendations. And this approach not only made the proposal more difficult for banks and their customers, but also weakened U.S. banks' global competitiveness. Ultimately, he took his eye off the ball and went in the wrong direction. So, Mr. Chairman, will the Federal Reserve commit to conducting a more thorough economic impact analysis before finalizing any capital requirements to ensure that they do not hinder economic growth?
Yes.
Regulatory overreach disproportionately impacts community and regional banks, which do not pose systematic or systemic risk for yet they face many of the same capital and compliance requirements as the largest institutions. So many of these banks serve as lifelines for small businesses, rural communities, and the first-time home buyers. And it's key for the Federal Reserve to protect these institutions and ensure that they are not subject to one-size-fits-all regulations. So, Mr. Chairman, what steps is the Federal Reserve taking to ensure that new regulations do not force consolidation in the banking industry, therefore make it a little harder for smaller institutions to compete?
So like everybody else, we see the consolidation that's happened really over the last 30, 40 years, and community banks going out of business and just fewer and fewer banks. And we know that may be happening due to technology and various things, but we and also just people moving to cities and away from rural areas. But we don't want our regulation to in any way foster that. So we try hard. I try as hard as we can to make sure that we're not letting the heavier regulation that we apply to the GSIBs and even to the regionals slip down to smaller institutions that are serving their community and generally doing a good job at that. And we try hard to do that. This is tailoring. It's very much of a basic value that we have, and it's also what we're instructed to do under the law. And I won't say we're perfect, but we do keep this in mind.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for being here. It's good to see you. And with that, I yield my time back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair turns to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our very capable and courageous ranking member. Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here today. As you know, my words, the CFPB has been disemboweled over the last 10 days or so, which probably people, there may not be much concern here on the Hill in certain quarters, but there are two things that I want to ask you about. Rules over at CFPB must be, from time to time, updated. Right now, there is no system for updating any of the rules. And one of the other issues is that is there a regulatory gap, or are there regulatory gaps that you can see clearly, that people can feel, because there is essentially no CFPB for the first time since the end of the Great Recession?
So I don't think we know where this comes to rest. You may have seen last night that the administration nominated somebody to be the permanent head of the CFPB. So I don't know I'm not sure what the end intention is here. But if you assume that it goes away, then yeah, there would be a gap. There wouldn't be any federal agency that can examine banks above 10 billion, whether they're state member banks or state non-member banks or national banks. That would be the case. But I'm not sure we know what the end game really is here.
In terms of regulatory gaps that are created when the agency was essentially shut down. Now, I'm assuming that there's been somebody appointed to complete the murder of the CFPB, and so if I'm correct, that means that there are some there have to be, or either or they've been tricking us all these years that they were not doing any regulations. But that's my political position. I was very proud in my community to get the Hispanic Chamber and the Black Chambers to come together. We got a building, they're functioning, big celebration all across my congressional district in Missouri. And then about 2 weeks ago, I started getting these phone calls, as I think many of us on both sides of the aisle have received. About 64% of small businesses have invoices unpaid for more than 60 days. And the Fed now, the Fed's real-time payment system allows individuals and small businesses to send and receive money instantly, which is a step in the right direction, Mr. Chairman. So what is the status of the FedNow adoption for financial institutions?
So it's coming along, as was the case with ACH back in the day. It takes quite a while. There's investment that has to take place on the part of banks, and so we're working with a lot of small and medium-sized banks to get them comfortable with the requirements of FedNow, so that this can build up over time. It's something that we expected to be slow in terms of uptake, and it has been a bit slow.
Well, is technology adoption a barrier for smaller community banks and mission-based lenders?
Yes, it is, and so we work with there are non-bank service providers that do reach out and do a good job with smaller institutions, and we encourage that. Those institutions can't actually have direct access, but their business is they have the information, and they can go to smaller institutions and show them how to do this, and that there's a lot of that going on. So, and we encourage that.
Thank you. Let me just say, I've been here on this committee for 20 years, and I've seen chairmen, Republicans and Democrats, and whether they are Republican or Democrat, they need to be independent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today, Chairman Powell. First, I want to reflect on our hearing on February 24th here in this same room, frankly, via Zoom for a lot of people because it was in the height of COVID. And during my 5 minutes, you felt confident that inflation being at 1.4% would stay under control, and it wouldn't be an issue despite the very large increase in the supply of money. We talked about M2. In a subsequent meeting, frankly, in my office, we discussed Milton Friedman's quantity theory of money in depth, and you believed that it was no longer relevant, that inflation would not hit consumers. We debated asset prices during the hearing, and you claimed that the Federal Reserve's massive purchases of treasuries did not distort the market. Lastly, during the Biden administration, you were actively calling for more fiscal stimulus at times. And at some point along the way, more dollars chasing fewer goods seems to have actually resulted in higher prices. All of these things, inflated money supply, inflated asset prices, inflated consumer prices, happened on your watch. In light of the actual outcomes, have your views changed?
Well, I think we've learned a lot, but maybe not the lessons you think. But I do think we've learned a lot from the situation. We and essentially all of mainstream macroeconomics thought that this would be transitory, and what that meant was it would go away fairly quickly as the supply side healed and as demand came down. And it didn't. It actually did go away, and substantially for those reasons. But it took 2 years.
And to that point, you felt like in the fall that it was going away and things were going to be under control, and you had achieved your soft landing. But the market pretty quickly spoke. I mean, frankly, rates went up over 100 basis points where you guys were going down. And now, in today's reports, we see that inflation's actually trending up quite a bit from where it was in the fall. So again, would you, in light of the facts, would you reassess what you're doing with the central planning?
You're right that long-term rates went up, but they did not go up because of expectations of higher inflation. There's no evidence of that. It's actually different things. It's not about inflation.
Well,
you look at markets. Markets are pricing in break-evens. I'll show you the.
So the markets don't believe there's increased risk with massive fiscal spending in the market, and they're not demanding a higher premium because there's more risk.
More risk, yes.